Transnational crime seems to be a fairly amorphous topic, a very global sort of thing, but it's really quite easy. It's any crime that involves the crime occurring over two countries, anything two or more countries, and that's a crime either in its inception, in the act, or in its consequences occurs in more than two countries. And again, that's a fairly broad definition, but if you break it out, it's really three different categories of behavior. So when you think of transnational crime, it's always good to think of there's transnational crimes that provide provision of illicit goods, provision of illicit services, or infiltration of business or government. And it would be hard to think of an exception to that rule. Provision of illicit goods would be things like trafficking in drugs, stolen property, counterfeit products, things like that. Illicit services would be human trafficking and sex, gambling, pornography, things like that. And then the third category, infiltration of legitimate business or government, that would be extortion, racketeering, corruption, those kinds of offenses. What is the value of knowing about transnational crime? There's a tremendous value because I would argue it's getting harder and harder to come up with exceptions to transnational crime. When you think about any crime that occurs to you, it is more and more difficult to find no transnational connection. So when you get spam emails, people trying to scam you in your emails, or most of those come from overseas. When you get inquiries that are fraudulent, if you buy a fake purse in New York somewhere, a knockoff, the odds are overwhelming that was in fact manufactured overseas, smuggled into the U.S. and being bought here. So in fact, many times you have illegal labor in a different continent and you don't actually see what the connection is, but it's a very clear connection. People who use the internet to traffic in people, sex, illegal forms of gambling, most of that involves transmissions and communications across countries. Usually the supply end is very different from the demand end. So more and more of the typical crimes that we expose ourselves to are in fact transnational crimes, even though it's not apparent to us. And for students, it's very important to know about it because now there's an increasing need for people with skills in computer forensics, in international relations, people with foreign language skills, people who are able to understand international law enforcement training has become crucial. So there's a whole new group of skill sets that students need to get up to speed on. The challenges for law enforcement around the world are similar to what they are in the U.S. And that is, no matter where you are around the world, police face the same issue. And the issue is, how do you enforce the law, maintain order effectively, while at the same time respecting the privacy of citizens? And the only way to protect people is, of course, interfere in the lives of people by asking questions. You have to stop people. You have to make inquiries. You have to engage in surveillance to do all those things. So the issue is, how do you maintain that balance between a citizen's reasonable expectation of privacy and the government's interest and society's interest in controlling crime and controlling violence? And this is, most of the issues around police are around that exact line. We have probable cause standards, stop and frisk standards to do that, and these have gotten to be very legally precise. A lot of court interpretations, both in the U.S. and around the world, on these thresholds. And these required well-trained police. These required good police supervision. How do you handle complaints against police in a reasonable way? So what's the best way to have a professionalized police presence that's transparent to the community and at the same time be effective in controlling crime? And so this has been an issue in policing throughout its entire history, and in transnational terms it's exactly the same. So the point is, if you wanted to make a dent, let's say, in how many fraudulent spam emails that people get, Well, there's one way to do it is to allow police to enter everyone's email accounts and look around. Right? Well, in most places, the society isn't ready to do that. But at the same time, we have, as you know, increasing instances of major corporations around the world and governments that are being hacked, and they're taking personal information of folks for fraudulent purposes. So the question is, how do you balance that privacy ultimately, but if you don't allow police to make their reasonable inquiries, many times citizens open themselves up to more victimization. So it is not an easy problem to solve. Technology has made all the difference. In the last 25 years, when you think about technology, the overwhelming majority of the world now has access to the internet. So whether you live in Somalia or you live in Canada, you live in the US, you live in the UK, no matter where you live, you have access to the same material for the first time. So you have a lot more exposure to experience far outside your own. And in addition to access to the internet, if you go around the world, virtually everybody has a cell phone, smartphones. So not only has the internet provided the information globally, now with the advent of handheld devices, more and more people have access to that information. So no matter what continent you happen to find yourself, you have the same access to information as anyone in Washington, D.C. or any other city has. So this is a good thing. This has helped disseminate information. You know immediately what's going on in other parts of the world. This is all great, but it provides opportunity for people who are disposed to commit crimes to try to victimize you, go after your information, and that kind of thing. A quick example, if I was to steal your wallet, that only gives me a very limited information. Most people don't carry much cash anymore. Once your wallet's gone, you have very limited liability. You cancel your credit cards. So it doesn't get me much anymore. I'm much more likely to gain benefit if I'm, in fact, going to get your personal information. All I need is your number and a PIN. That gets me much further, because once you lose your wallet, it doesn't take you long to realize it's gone. But if I get access to your information, I could slowly drain. I can put false charges, try to drain your bank account slowly. I can do a lot more damage because you are unaware that your information has been taken. And all of that is made available through advances in technology that just didn't exist 25 years ago to the extent they exist today. In terms of the rise of cyber-related, internet-related crimes, there is headquartered in West Virginia, the Internet Fraud Complaint Center. And the amount of complaints to that center has gone up dramatically over the years. As you would expect, as access to the internet, the amount of, just think of in your own personal life, the amount of Christmas shopping you do online now than what you did 10 years ago. Now it's dramatically increased. So all these are opportunities, because in each transaction, you're transmitting personal information over the internet. So as more and more people do that around the world, there's just more and more opportunity to try to defraud you. Well, the most interesting period for transnational crime is, of course, the current period, what we call the age of globalization. And when you consider what happened starting roughly late 80s or early 90s to the present, is where the explosion occurred. We had the simultaneous increase of traffic by air, more people traveling to more places than ever before. When you look at the previous generation, very few people traveled, and very few traveled internationally. Now everybody travels internationally. So you have that combined with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you have so that opened borders not only to business but also to tourists, trade, everything else. And then you had the rise of all these emerging democracies. All of Eastern Europe changed, and this is all over the last 25 years. So you have a lot of new, weak, unstable governments who are, getting their footing around the world. But all of this creates criminal opportunities as well as opportunities for legitimate business. And This is what gave the impetus to the rise of transnational crime on the scale that we have today. When you look at transnational crime across cultures, it's a very interesting thing, because when you think of transnational crime as a flow, because it always involves two or more countries, the developing world, that is, developing countries, which is the majority of the world, most of the world are developing countries that are building their economies, as opposed to the developed world like Western Europe and the U.S. and Japan and some others who have fully developed economies. Most of the flows go from supply to demand. So when you look at human trafficking, most of the flow goes from developing countries to developed countries. If you look at drug trafficking, most of the flow from developing countries to developed countries. The developed countries have the money. They're the ones who create most of the demand. When you look at smuggling of ivory, of gold, of rhinoceros horn, of all kinds of things, you see that flow. So when you look at efforts by the United Nations and other bodies, they are interested in interrupting that flow. You have the demand by the developed world and the supply by the developing world. Developing worlds, sometimes there's self-exploitation going on. In many cases, they're being exploited by people from the developed world. So you have to account for those two perspectives. So the human trafficking issue in a developing country is a very different thing than it is in a developed world. It's different kinds of problems. On the developed side, you're trying to reduce demand. And on the developing side, you're trying to reduce pushes on that supply. You know, why are so many people leaving the country, interested in leaving the country? What can we do to keep them so they can thrive in their own country? So the perspective across cultures is quite different. You can be talking about the same issue, human trafficking, for example, or drug trafficking, whatever, but the issue manifests itself in very different ways depending on what part of the world you're in. An interesting question is, what does the future for transnational crime hold? Is it going to be more of the same, or is it going to be, quantitatively different in some way? It's very hard to predict, because opportunities change criminal opportunities. For example, who would have thought 20 years ago that most people on the planet would be walking with a portable phone in their hand? If you would have told me that would be as common in the developing world as in the developed world, I never would have guessed that. And that people would be accessing the internet regularly from a handheld device, which means you don't have to buy a $2,000 computer to access the internet. You can do it through a handheld phone. So this is great. It's great for business. It's great for personal autonomy. It's good for economies. It's good for marketing, but it creates new opportunities. So it's very likely that there will be additional changes in technology that are in fact going to manifest themselves in terms of creating new criminal opportunities. Because when you think of transnational crime in the future, think of it as a cat and mouse game. As we get more effective in closing down criminal opportunities, there still remain a group of people who are motivated not to work and will try to get money by scamming. So you close off one opportunity, people will actively work full time. If I can't get access to your personal information anymore, I will try to access it elsewhere. And we have seen this. For example, in the U.S., when you reduce cocaine usage in the U.S., which has been declining in recent years, the effect of that is there's more trafficking to Europe of cocaine. So you would think that would have an effect on the supply. Well, no, they just look for different markets. And then, well, most of the cocaine in the world is coming from a few countries in South America. It's hard to do the direct flight from South America to Europe. So what happens, they create many of the flights stop in Africa. So you have corruption going on there to get them onto smaller planes or boats to get them into Europe. So many times you successfully do something like lower illicit drug use in the U.S., but it just changes the manifestation of the problem rather than actually solves the problem. So these are things that are, in fact, difficult to anticipate, but you need people thinking about this all the time. The research on transnational crime has evolved in parallel fashion to transnational crime itself. When you look at the number of journals with the word international in the title in criminology and criminal justice, that's gone up dramatically in the last 20 years. There's a journal called Global Crime. There's all kinds of journals with transnational, international in the title, showing. And you look at the content of those journals, there's more and more studies involving crimes that cross borders or crimes comparing to two different countries or more. So there is a lot more of that going on. And the impact of that on policy has been dramatic. The two most important examples would be the UN conventions in 2003, the United Nations, which again, the United Nations is a conglomeration of 193 countries on Earth, which is pretty much everybody. And they came together and ratified the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And that went into effect in 2003. It's now been ratified by more than 3/4 of the world. The reason why it's important, because it does have enforcement provisions. So ratifying countries, which is most of the world, must have certain laws against certain types of conduct. They must be making prosecutions. They must have some kind of witness protection program to protect whistleblowers and people like that. So there's all kinds of interesting things, including a provision for extradition of folks. If one country has a criminal caught in another country, to develop international provisions for bringing that person back for trial. These are very important developments. But a lot of them came about due to the fact, well, research is showing how transnational crime flows. Once you document what those flows are, that helps people in policy positions to say, okay, this is what we need in a way to counteract this flow of illicit goods or people or money. Another example of an international policy effort that's related to research would be the UN Convention Against Corruption. That went into effect in 2005, and that looks specifically at crimes of corruption. So like the Transnational Organized Crime Convention, this looks at corruption offenses. Around the world, you can make the argument that corruption is the most serious crime of all on the planet, because without corruption, it's impossible to have an ongoing criminal enterprise that's protected from police. You have to have some degree of immunity from law enforcement or from the judiciary or from politicians, and the only way to do that is through corruption. And that's been a serious problem around the world in many places. And so what the Corruption Convention does is mandate countries that are ratifying, and again, more than 3/4 of the world has ratified that agreement, that in fact makes countries pass certain laws to prohibit certain forms of corruption, have certain enforcement mechanisms in place, extradition agreements, things like that. And there's a meeting of conferences to the convention every 2 years where they look at what the implementation has been. So, for example, if you're a country who ratifies the UN Convention Against Corruption and you have no corruption prosecutions this year, well, you have explaining to do. And most of what the UN has done is provide training and technical assistance to countries around the world to say, this is how the law should be written, this is how you conduct investigations, this is optimum ways to handle extradition requests, things like that. To get the world up to speed so they're enforcing transnational crime with the same level of intensity. And you have to do this with transnational crime because it, by definition, involves more than one country. So you have to get multiple countries at the same level of competence. The way that I got involved with transnational crime is because I've always been interested in organized crime in general. And because organized crime is ongoing criminal activity, which has always interested me, the people involved in it are not necessarily smart, but they're very clever. They're always seeking angles to do something illegally. And perhaps the best example I can think of is in the book by Henry Hill, which is made into the movie Goodfellas. His boss, Paul Vario, would go to the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center. Nice high-rise place, go to a club, dinner, dancing. It cost a fortune. But his boss would always do that on a stolen credit card. And if you or I would do that, go out for a night of drinking and dancing, with, your friends or family, and you were on a stolen credit card, you couldn't enjoy yourself, right? You'd be a nervous wreck, thinking you're going to be caught and embarrassed, humiliated. But Henry Hill's boss said, no, I couldn't enjoy myself if I was spending my own money. It's a force. So it's that upside down ethic that's contrary to what regular people like you and I would think. We'd be a nervous wreck. We could never enjoy ourselves. But he couldn't enjoy himself. It was his own money. He said, I couldn't spend my own money on this. So it was like a thrill of the illegal activity. So I've always been interested in that. And then as current events unfolded with globalization, collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the internet, transnational business, all these kinds of things, organized crime has become global. And to the way it was not, 30 years ago. So to me, it's just an outgrowth of that interest in organized criminal activity. People always looking for ways to scam the system rather than going out and getting like a real job. It's always interesting because these people are in fact clever, so you have to be more clever, to stay ahead of them. So I just find that inherently fascinating. As a criminologist, I can say the contribution of research to society is a very slow process. People are into research. You're in research to build knowledge. And knowledge gets built in small pieces. Rarely are there, breakthrough studies. Those are very rare in any field. You build research by a series of small studies, looking at, for example, human trafficking between, Albania and Italy, and then you say, okay, that's interesting finding. I wonder if that would hold from, Africa into Southern Europe, or from the U.S. within the U.S. So you need multiple studies to build on this, how it's organized, who the traffickers are. So most researchers like me, you do your work through a number of these small studies, and then it's that body of work you hope that impacts policy. That is, we have common features of human trafficking enterprises, and this is how they're structured, this is how they're organized, and that is the kind of information that policymakers need to then change laws, change enforcement strategies, and change your whole approach to transnational crime.